presence of one party's personnel in the territory of the other party shall be governed by the agreement between Australia and PNG regarding the status of forces, and that's the 1977 agreement. So this framework that you're referring to, embedded in it, in Article 4, the only reference point is the 1977 Status of Forces Agreement. So I don't see how this framework actually provides any immunity, for example, for an AFP officer who may be called to respond to a crisis in domestic violence or one of the other areas that have been defined as security under this agreement.
Senator, you're right. The intention of the parties was not to expand through this agreement itself on the privileges and immunities beyond what they currently are. And as you say, the Status of Forces Agreement covers those of defence personnel. What Article 7, though, does is allow parties to enter subsidiary agreements for implementing the arrangements, and the reference previously to, if I could say in shorthand, the most favoured nation clause means that should Papua New Guinea enter an arrangement that provided another country's personnel more favourable privileges and immunities than the ones that we have, we would also be able to negotiate an agreement that reflected those if similar circumstances applied. So it provides us that protection that our personnel would always have the best possible treatment that's available, or that Papua New Guinea is willing to provide to the personnel of any other country. But in this agreement itself, it doesn't seek to adjust the privileges and immunities as they stand.
Sure. So in and of itself, this agreement, absent any subsequent subsidiary agreement, doesn't change the effect of the High Court decision of May 2005.
Correct.
Okay, so can you just clarify then? You said defence personnel are covered by the Status of Forces Agreement. By that, do you mean ADF personnel, or does that include defence civilians, defence contractors, other people who may be sent there by the Department of Defence?
Thank you. I'll ask Air Commodore Keane to clarify, but it is the same scope of personnel covered by the Status of Forces Agreement.
Right, and Senator Air Commodore Keane again from the Department of Defence. Could I come back to you in relation to contractors? So I might have to take on notice. Certainly there are provisions in the existing Status of Force Agreement that can make provision for defence members and other members accompanying the force. I think in the terminology that we used in 1970s. However, I would have to come back quite specifically in relation to contractors if that was an issue of interest to you.
Well, what's of interest to me is that we have referenced here a 1977 Status of Forces Agreement where the conception of security was indeed protecting one's borders, perhaps civil disruption, etc. But we've now redefined security to include cyber, climate change, violence against women and children, and critical infrastructure. Not many of those tasks are the core business of the Australian Defence Force, which says to me that anyone who's going to be deployed to Papua New Guinea dealing with what is now a significantly expanded conception of security at the moment has no coverage. That's my concern. Am I incorrect?
Senator, I'll ask Ms McKenna to expand, but the intention of the parties in articulating particularly the privileges and immunities that would apply to personnel in both of our countries was that we would have the status quo. So it articulated the Status of Forces Agreement because we know that under the Status of Forces Agreement, there are a suite of privileges and immunities that are existing, and then it articulated that new arrangements or agreements this is Article 4B I'm looking at, could be applicable in the future. And then Article 7.2 articulates that that these subsidiary agreements can be negotiated in due course. There was certainly no intention to apply the Status of Forces Agreement to a larger suite of personnel than it currently applies to. But there was a recognition that as we go forward, there may be circumstances under which our two countries may want to negotiate additional privileges and immunities.
Thank you, Senator. In answer to that question, as Ms Peake has said, the Status of Forces Agreement is preserved intact and its scope is as provided for under that agreement. What Article 4B does is allow for any other agreements or arrangements that might be negotiated between Australia and Papua New Guinea to apply to whichever personnel are covered by those agreements or arrangements. And then Article 7.2 contemplates that the parties could, if they so decided in future, enter into such agreements or arrangements, including to implement this bilateral security agreement and the broader security scope that Ms Peake outlined in her opening statements. Those subsequent subsidiary agreements or arrangements could be ongoing in their scope, or they could be negotiated on an ad hoc basis to cover particular activities. That would be a matter that's envisaged to be subject to the intent and agreement of the parties in the future and the needs that were identified.
So my concern is that, having spent some months as a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee dealing with the Security of Critical Infrastructure Bill here in Australia, what became very clear was that it was the view of Home Affairs and ASD and others that the security of critical infrastructure from a cybersecurity perspective required laws that allowed the Commonwealth to step in for our domestic critical infrastructure in terms of cybersecurity and disruption, if we're to have a meaningful partnership with Papua New Guinea and support them in the defence of their critical infrastructure, particularly when it comes to cyber attacks, this, if we're going to apply the same standards we apply here in Australia, requires a timely intervention. But what I'm hearing here is that it would require another process of negotiation and agreement, and I'm assuming ratification by their parliament, before any Australian experts, whether they be public servants or contractors, would be able to set foot in Port Moresby to assist them in dealing with those security threats, which surely undermines the efficacy of the agreement. So are we in advance starting negotiations on any of these subsidiary agreements to allow a timely response to such threats?
Senator, you're absolutely right that cyber is one of those areas that is a big focus for both of our countries, and at the recent ministerial forum, indeed, it was a significant topic of conversation between ministers, including particularly led by Minister O'Neill, around cyber attacks more generally, but as they apply to critical infrastructure, as you have said. We do not anticipate that we would require a subsidiary agreement before we can deploy cyber specialists to support Papua New Guinea on request. Usually privileges and immunities tend to be seen from an Australian government perspective as critical for officers acting in particular roles, particularly operational roles for the police and operational roles for our armed forces, because they're at risk, I guess, of particular engagement with the public or other scenarios that may require privileges and immunities. We don't expect those same risks would enliven for cyber experts to support Papua New Guinea's resilience building, or indeed a response to an attack. And we have already started cooperation in that area. So we don't see any barriers to that, and certainly have a policy intention to accelerate our cooperation. And I should say that most recently our Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, Brendan Dowling, had visited Papua New Guinea just a few weeks ago to have exchanges with many ministers to support that cooperation proceeding.
Senator Fawcett, I want to make sure I give Mr Pike a chance before we run out of time.
One last question then. Have you had engagement then with the Department of Home Affairs around their experience as we put in place our legislation for security of critical infrastructure about the concerns of commercial entities who operate critical infrastructure, about the possibility of a Commonwealth official getting onto or having access to their IT systems, which may cause commercial loss, and who would be liable for that? Because I'm imagining, whilst a contractor going to Port Moresby probably wouldn't be involved in a physical alteration or physical harm, commercial harm is a very real possibility, and immunities, I'm imagining, would still be just as important there as they were in the discussion here. So have you engaged Home Affairs to understand the scope of issues they had to deal with here to apply to this relationship with Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Excellent question. The short answer is yes. Indeed, our Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, Brendan Dowling, came out of the Department of Home Affairs, and he was indeed the lead through Home Affairs in many of those reforms to our system to build resilience into our system. So we have very good links back to Home Affairs and seek to not only draw our experience out to support Papua New Guinea's resilience, but also cognizant of those issues that you raised.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
I might suggest, Senator Foster, because I think that's a very interesting line of questioning, you might care to just put something in writing. I mean, it may be something that we could get back a little bit more detail in writing about those different kinds of scenarios that you've outlined. And I don't think it'd be a bad idea if we put that through the Secretariat in email form. We could perhaps get a little bit more detail about the separate kinds of engagement that are contemplated and some of those issues, commercial risk, etc. I'll just go to Mr Pike, in case he's got some questions.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question in relation to, I suppose, going off what Senator Fawcett has highlighted, there are a number of issues, and obviously we've got a really quickly changing strategic environment, and technological advances, of course, are getting quicker and quicker. Just in relation to the way that an agreement of this nature can be amended, and I note in the papers it mentioned that there's a provision in there for a general review after 5 years. 5 years is obviously a long time in the global strategic context at the moment. I'm just wondering, is that a standard element of these sort of agreements? And what exactly a 5-year review would look like from the department's perspective? How does the department make sure that everything that could be amended as part of a 5-year review would be captured? Particularly in light of what Senator Fawcett's raised there.
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. I would just say two things with respect to, I guess, keeping the agreement current and also the review. The parties can amend the agreement indeed at any time by mutual consent to keep it up to date and current. The process for doing so is that the amendments would be agreed in writing, and then they would come into force in the way that any treaty action comes into force, as we're doing at the moment. So there's a formal way to keep the BSA up to date, and in addition, in terms of the review, yes, it is quite common to have review provisions in in treaties, particularly ones of this scope that cover many different agencies and have many lines of effort that sit under a broader framework, we would utilise the architecture that I spoke about, and indeed my colleague spoke about at the beginning, in terms of ensuring it was meeting Papua New Guinea's needs as well as our own. So that's architecture at leader, ministerial and officials level, and through the different line agencies separately. These reviews are often quite a significant endeavour, and we have already started working with Papua New Guinea on sort of implementation frameworks so that we can collectively keep track of how we're implementing the agreement and the support and capacity building associated with it.
Thanks, Chair. That's all from me.
Thank you, Mr. Pike. Just a last one for me, which I'll just ask you to take on notice. It's been raised with us a couple of times that as we strengthen a range of our security relationships and do, in some cases, create new status of forces agreements or agreements like this that could affect or require us to update existing status of force agreements. It's been raised with us the potential value of, I think, what's described in the United States as the Lay Act framework, Lay, L-E-A-H-Y being the name of the congressperson who brought forward that initiative. And as I understand it, the Lay Act framework, it's just about being able to give appropriate consideration in every direction to how defence forces interact and the personnel that are involved. I'll just ask if you take on notice whether or not Australia has given some consideration to the adequacy of our arrangements with that respect, or whether we've seen the introduction of the Lay Act and its operation as something that we think Australia might move towards. But I'll ask if I'm happy for you just to take that on notice. It's probably a bit of a longer answer than could be given in these circumstances. And other than that, I thank you for your attendance here today. You'll get a copy of the transcript of your evidence and have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. Please send responses to questions taken on notice, the one I've just given, and I think it would be helpful if Senator Foster's happy to frame up the particulars of the questions that he had, which will come to you via the Secretariat. If you could make sure that we get those responses by the close of business on the 29th of July. And otherwise, I now declare this hearing closed. I'll declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties for its inquiry into the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity Agreement relating to supply chain resilience. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we respectively meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. In accordance with the Committee's resolution of 4 August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I remind members of the media of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I welcome representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Industry, Science and Resources to give evidence. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Sure. I'll start. Chris Yost, Director of Supply Chain Resilience Section at Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
And Donna Looney, I'm the head of the Sovereign Capability and Supply Chains Division in the Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Kate Mitchell, Director in the International Law Branch at DFAT.
Eunice Chan, Director of the IPEF Strategy and Coordination Section at DFAT.
Tristan Cohen's, Acting Director, IPEF Trade Negotiation Section.
Rebecca Williams, Acting Director of the Plurilateral Digital and Services Law Section within DFAT.
Ms. Blundell, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Chair. Charlotte Blundell. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Indo-Pacific Economic and Supply Chain Branch in DFAT.
Excellent. The committee doesn't require you to give your evidence today under oath, but the hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, therefore has the same standing as the proceedings of the respective houses, which means giving false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence you give today will be recorded by Hansard and does attract parliamentary privilege. It's the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record questions on notice that are taken. I invite you, to any of you who would like to do so, to make an opening statement before we proceed to questions and a discussion.
Chair, I would like to do that. Charlotte Blundell, Indo-Pacific Economic and Supply Chain Branch DFAT, on behalf of our delegation today. May I please start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are all meeting today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear on behalf of the government on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity Agreement relating to supply chain resilience, or the IPEF Supply Chain Agreement. The IPEF Supply Chain Agreement was signed on the 14th of November 2023 by Australia's Minister for Trade and Tourism, the Honourable Don Farrell, together with his counterparts from Brunei, Fiji, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines, the Republic of Singapore, the Kingdom of Thailand, and the United States of America. And the Socialist Republic of Vietnam also signed the IPEF Supply Chain Agreement earlier this year. IPEF was initiated by the United States, but it's been shaped by all 14 IPEF founding countries. Australia has been an active participant in this project, the aim of which has been to build treaty-level cooperation with close trading partners to frame engagement on contemporary challenges that have until now not been systematically addressed. In its entirety, IPEF will comprise 4 binding international agreements covering trade, supply chains, clean energy, tax and anti-corruption. And there will be a 5th component of IPEF, the IPEF Agreement, which is an overarching framework that establishes a governance framework and ensures the coherence and complementarity of the 4 pillars I just referred to. The Supply Chain Agreement was the first IPEF agreement to be concluded. It's a first of its kind agreement that sets an important precedent in the way that governments can collaborate to advance supply chain resilience through trade policy and public sector tools. All of the parties involved in the negotiation were, of course, alive to the fact that supply chain disruptions are best managed by industry, by private sector. However, the experience, particularly of the last few years, has demonstrated with great starkness that some supply chain disruptions have significant spillover effects for our national security, for public health and safety, and for overall national economic stability. And it's these kinds of disruptions that are therefore a concern for governments. They occur due to global and regional epidemics or climate change or natural disasters, because of cyber incidents, logistical interruptions, fluctuations in the availability of critical raw materials, geopolitics or international conflict. And such events can affect Australian importers and exporters, our consumers and households, and exacerbate inflation and cost of living pressures. These are international challenges, Chair, and they can't be solved by Australia acting on its own. The Supply Chain Agreement is an initiative which draws from this learning. It provides a useful collaborative tool with a group of countries with whom Australia trades regularly, and it will contribute towards diversifying our critical supply chains, informing Australia's response to supply chain crises and disruptions, and improving outcomes for workers in regional supply chains. This is primarily achieved via the establishment of 3 new pieces of regional architecture: an IPEF Supply Chain Council, a Crisis Response Network, and a new Labour Rights Advisory Board. If I could just speak briefly about each of these new pieces of architecture. The Supply Chain Council will enhance resilience and address concentrations and choke points in critical supply chains through the development of sector-specific action plans. And this will require the parties to sit together and map out our vulnerabilities and our capabilities. From Australia's perspective, this provides an opportunity through the Supply Chain Council for us to promote our unique export capabilities as a source of potential alternative supply, and to develop critical relationships, knowledge and skills to reduce the number of disruptions affecting critical goods. Our involvement can inform Australia's approach to better insulating our businesses and communities from global shocks, including through identifying alternative sources of critical supplies. The second piece of architecture in the Supply Chain Agreement, the Crisis Response Network, gives the means for parties to work together to address critical time-sensitive disruptions when they occur. The Crisis Response Network will create what we believe is a world-first emergency communications mechanism to enhance regional coordination during major supply chain disruptions. This will facilitate faster collective responses to critical shortages, help ensure Australia's access to critical goods and reduce market instability. It will also support our businesses and consumers to adapt and be resilient during a crisis. Importantly, the IPEF Supply Chain Agreement will provide a platform for Australia to influence other countries, discouraging the imposition of unilateral interventionist market-distorting policies, such as some of the export controls on critical goods that were introduced during the pandemic. The IPEF Supply Chain Agreement also provides an avenue for us to advocate for greater transparency on labour practices in the region's supply chains. The Labour Rights Advisory Board will consist of government, worker and employer representatives and be combined with a facility-specific mechanism for resolving identified labour rights challenges. And this will represent a major collective lift to uphold and enforce labour protections across the region. Chair, in conclusion, the IPEF Supply Chain Agreement has already entered into force in February this year, with 8 countries having deposited their instruments of ratification, acceptance or approval. The Australian government, in signing this treaty, would be signalling that it sees value in engaging with this group of partners on this agenda, and we hope we're able to move expeditiously towards ratification so that Australia can play an active role in the development of this important IPEF agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Blundell. I'll start with a few questions and then go to my fellow committee members. the most recent experience that the Australian community had of what can go awry from a supply chain point of view in certain crisis circumstances was obviously the pandemic. There's a sort of recognition at the time that the world had moved significantly towards a very efficient and cost-effective but somewhat fragile sort of just-in-time inventory management approach where things were all moving around smoothly and quickly, and nobody kept stocks of things particularly because that's not very efficient. It was all right. They would be arriving the very next day. Obviously, the pandemic showed us all that there is fragility in that system. I'm just interested in, as we enter into the supply chain part of the IPEF framework, what the underlying analysis that occurred during and immediately after the pandemic that showed us, our own particular vulnerabilities and therefore areas of focus when it comes to trying to manage that kind of supply chain flow better.
Chair, if I could direct that question to Donna Looney, I think that we had both an international experience recently related to AdBlue that I think is a good example here for the committee to understand, but also in DISE's leadership of assessing that vulnerability. I think it's worth hearing from Donna, if that's okay, Chair.
Of course.
Thank you, Chair. Donna Looney, Head of Sovereign Capability and Supply Chains Division. I think that I might just go back a little. You mentioned the pandemic as a point in time where we started to understand our supply chains and their vulnerabilities as well as criticalities in a bit more detail. This stemmed from a Productivity Commission report and then under the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet at the time, the Office of Supply Chain Resilience was established, and under that office there was a framework determined for how it was that we could look at supply chain vulnerability and criticality. So we look at quite a few things under that. So what I might just walk you through is our framework, if that's useful. So this was established through consultation with industry, with academia and other stakeholders, and in particular with international stakeholders as well. So the supply chain resilience framework, in terms of vulnerability, we look at the quantitative and qualitative analysis and stakeholder engagement. So we look at data through a multitude of systems, and we've brought together a particular AI tool that can bring that data together to tell us the story on a particular good and how it travels through a supply chain. And then we supplement that with the qualitative analysis that we get through regular engagement on the ground with industry. We hold a supply chain roundtable once a month, and that has approximately 20 to 25 peak industry bodies representing many industries, and we get together monthly and bring government observers into that as well to hear about what industry is seeing on the ground. We look at criticality, in particular the impact on Australia's national interest, and when we talk about national interest in this particular context, the key things we look at is if it would materially impact the health, safety and wellbeing of the community, economic stability and viability, national security and shared strategic interests with key international partners. We then look at resilience and industry's capacity to prevent, absorb, adapt or transform to these disruptions in their supply chains. And following that, we look at what the residual risk may be to Australia, and we look at targeted and proportionate options, low-cost options through to high-cost options, And just to give you an example of some of those things, in terms of the low-cost options, we look at no-regrets policies where we're informing industry of what we're seeing, and we're seeking to work with them to look at their supply chains. As Ms Blundell mentioned earlier, we see industry as the first line of how it is that we can address some of these supply chains through informing industry about where it is that there may be vulnerabilities, so they can look to how they might diversify through those types of things. We have a Category B and a Category C. We go down to Category D actions, which is where it is that government might need to have a more interventionist approach, such as onshoring and those types of things to address issues. So there's not one response to everything. It's not one size fits all. We have a scale of interventions that can potentially happen. I might just mention to you that through this framework, we looked at where Australia's vulnerabilities may sit. At the moment, we've got around 9 critical goods that we look at, which include semiconductors, pharmaceuticals and medical products, fertilisers, diesel exhaust fluids, which goes to the AdBlue point that we raised earlier, telecommunications equipment, water treatment chemicals, renewable energy technologies, crop protection products, and personal protective equipment. This list can be revised at any time, and we are constantly looking at the data and listening to stakeholders to see where it is that there could be emerging supply chain disruptions, while we're also preparing for future shocks, whether that's another pandemic or some of the other issues that we've seen in terms of supply chain disruptions, including around things like weather events and geopolitical situations. The one thing that I might just add to that is that OSCA, or the Office of Supply Chain Resilience, in its establishment and its work on this framework, has been leading the way for a lot of development of how it is that we look at these matters internationally, and we've been sharing our learnings with other countries and building capability with other countries. And the reason for that international engagement on supply chains, I think, is really twofold. One is to be able to share information about where we have similar supply chain disruptions. And so that goes to how it is that we can, systematically look at having established systems to be able to influence and adapt where there's a supply chain issue. But the other thing that we've been doing by leading the way in sharing our learnings is that it helps us to influence other countries to have a similar approach and a similar framework in place, so that when we're talking about supply chain disruptions and criticality and vulnerability, we're really singing from the same song sheet, so to speak, in that we have an understanding of what we mean by those critical goods, and I've just listed 9 of those for Australia, but looking at how it is that we work internationally to make sure that the identification of those goods happens in a systematic way across our different partners, and that's where we've been able to bring our learnings, particularly in through the IPEF agreement.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. Like, I can understand how the Supply Chain Council will just be a coordinating mechanism that gets everyone who's part of it to have a look at the issue in an interrelated way, but also encouraging each individual nation member to consider their own circumstances and their own planning. Then obviously the Supply Chain Crisis Response Network would be aimed at making sure that when these things happen, there's sort of lines of communication and authority consultation, rather than what would often be the case in a crisis, that the turtle withdraws into its shell and everyone tends to kind of lock down a little bit. Obviously, pandemic literally locking down, but the tendency in those situations can be unhelpful. Everyone holds on to what they've got. Everyone goes into a kind of a crisis mode, and then you get that that sort of sequence of flow-on obstructions. Ms Blundell, this one's probably back to you, just because it's been raised by other submitters. obviously the JSCOT has a particular function in terms of parliamentary engagement, supervision with international agreements that the government of the day has decided to consider and recommends entering. Some submitters have raised the fact that Australia is sort of already participating in some of these bodies, even though we haven't completed our process, and that's not really in keeping with the sort of the spirit of the process. It sort of seems, in the way that the submitters have put it, it sort of just presumes that the committee process will rubber stamp the agreement, and therefore that Australia can kind of act as if it has already ratified the agreement. Is that a fair kind of question that's being raised, or is that a bit of a misapprehension?
The latter, Chair. From our perspective, IPEF is a bit different as an economic framework, with this real emphasis on collaboration in resolving these, emergent disruptions, as you very well just put it a moment ago, and preparing, through simulation and discussion for those kinds of challenges. The agreement itself that we're talking about today allows IPEF signatories, which Australia is, which have yet to ratify it, to still participate in shaping these bodies that sit under the agreement up until the 24th of February 2025. And there's a few countries in Australia's position. This is just intended to allow all parties that have different and some more comprehensive treaty-making processes a chance to still contribute to shaping these bodies as we go through the process. And so we're just participating at this point in the terms of reference that are being developed for those bodies to ensure they're in Australia's interest, but we are doing that strictly without prejudice to JSCOT's absolute prerogative to review and report and give advice on this agreement. And other countries involved in this are very aware that Australia is still in its treaty-making process.
Thank you. So my final question, and I'll see Mr. Pike or Senator Fawcett have some questions as well. There's the aspect of the Supply Chain Council that goes to supply chain resilience, but it also has I think, very welcome sort of positive or proactive potential in the Labour Rights Advisory Board. And one of the things that was welcomed by submitters like the ACTU and AFTINET is the focus on eradicating asbestos from supply chains. So I just invite someone to respond on that. It's good that it seems that has been sort of identified as an early focus area. I'm just interested in how we see that working and what Australia can contribute to that.
Chair, I think if Tristan would take that question, please, Tristan.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thank you, Chair Tristan Cohen's Acting Director, IPEF Trade Negotiation Section. It was imparted on us at a very early stage in the IPEF negotiating process by our stakeholders, including the one that you mentioned, ACTU, on the importance of negotiating an outcome on asbestos, recognising the threat it causes to workers around the region. So taking that feedback from our stakeholders, we prioritised that throughout the course of the negotiations, and we're rather happy with the outcome that we achieved, recognising that there's still, of course, quite a bit of work to go in eradicating asbestos use and to transferring to safer product alternatives. So recognising that the outcome that we got places emphasis on cooperation, including through capacity building and technical assistance to partners to eradicate asbestos use. We'd anticipate developing some capacity assistance programs, leveraging off some of the existing good work that's done by non-government partners around the region to that objective. We're just in the early stages of our own thinking in order to make good that commitment that we achieved in that agreement, including through some of that capacity building and technical assistance, which I mentioned. And the last point I would sort of mention on asbestos is that while we're not discussing it today, the IPEF trade agreement negotiations, they're still in play, and we're looking hopefully to get an outcome on asbestos under that agreement once we head towards concluding those negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Foster?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just have a couple of questions. Article 10 basically says that each party must identify its critical sectors or key goods, including the impact of potential shortages on national security, public health, etc. There's then an exemption in Article 15 where it says nothing actually obliges a party to reveal things going to national security. But then it also says in paragraph 55 of the national interest summary, Article 15 talks about nothing precludes a party from applying measures it considers necessary to fulfil its obligations with respect to international peace, security, or the protection of its own essential security interests. So despite Article 13 that talks about things being confidential, Article 15 basically means a country can do whatever it likes with the information if it thinks it's in its national interests. So as we look at nations such as or governments such as the Chinese Communist Party with their national security law that obliges industry and other players to reveal what we would all consider to be classified commercial or personal information on request, countries obviously have different interpretations as to what's in their national interest. So across the list of members of IPEF, what assurance can you provide this committee and hence the Australian people that any information we provide won't be revealed, passed on to third parties because another nation thinks that it's necessary to fulfil its obligations to the protection of its own essential security interests?
Thank you for the question, Rebecca. I think this might be a good opportunity perhaps to speak to the confidentiality clause.
Yeah, that's clause 13, but 15 overrides that. It says that basically they can do whatever they think is necessary.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Chair. There is obviously some interplay between Article 13 and Article 15, but equally the provisions of the agreement that create substantive obligations or non-binding commitments in relation to the information that might be exchanged. I'll speak to Article 15 first, which provides the security exception. That provides clarity that parties to the agreement are not required to disclose certain information. This is consistent with language used in other trade agreements to which Australia is a party to provide certainty that parties are not required to disclose information that they consider or that they determine to be contrary to their security interests. Equally, that obviously interrelates to Article 13, and that seeks to provide some assurance that information that is exchanged between the parties in relation to this agreement are to maintain the confidentiality of that information. So the two provisions do slightly different things. Article 13 contains more extensive confidentiality language than in some of our other agreements, but that is mindful of the sensitive information that is to be exchanged in the spirit of sort of cooperation and collaboration under this agreement. I might pass to Chris or to others to speak to the kinds of information in question.
Well, just before you do, my concern is that Article 15 really has two limbs. The first part of it, you are correct, goes to this doesn't construe that a party has to disclose anything contrary to its national security interests. But then there's an or to preclude a party from applying measures it considers necessary to fulfil its obligations with respect to international peace and security or the protection of its own essential security interests. So that first "or" essentially makes that second limb separate to the topic of disclosure and allows it to apply any other measures it considers necessary for the protection of its own security interests, which could involve the disclosure to a third party.
I think it's possible, Senator, that 15B isn't just about information. It sort of almost gives, as often is the case with these international agreements, a kind of a cutout that whilst obviously we're all hoping to be more caring and sharing and allow the free flow of things better in these crisis circumstances in future, it may well be that that a nation decides for its own essential security interests that it does need to withhold the supply of something in particular that it might otherwise not withhold, and that's considered okay. I mean, but for those kinds of provisions, no country tend to enter into these things. But I'm not trying to give you the answer that these good folk.
I was going to say, Mr. Wilson, what's your position within DFAT? I hadn't seen that change of job recently, but anyway, let's go back to the witnesses.
Well, as Senator Foster, as someone who's been in the parliamentary committee game for a long time, as I said at the beginning, this is a discussion, and we're all offering our interpretations. I'm just trying to be helpful as the chair of the committee. But as I say, I defer to the people who are here to give their evidence.
Thank you very much, Chair. That's correct. Article 15B is not limited to measures relating to information or confidentiality. It is more broadly crafted than that, and would be directed to measures outside of the context of information sharing. And as you say, Chair, this is language that's commonly seen in several of other Australia's other trade and investment agreements.
So I'm assuming that you can provide some assurance to the committee that we would have a measured approach in terms of what we disclose as to supply chain issues that directly impact on our national security in terms of what we put into that forum, even given Article 13. That we wouldn't just be disclosing everything that we think is critical.
Senator Chris Yost, Supply Chain Resilience Section Director. Yes, that's right. We would take a very careful approach to what was shared, as you would expect, and I think as other countries would similarly do in this forum. And I think, as a general principle, I mean, this entire agreement is based around, a high degree of building up trust, developing those relationships, and so. This is something that's going to take a bit of time to develop sort of muscle memory and practice. But I think, yes, that would be our approach. We would be taking a very considered approach to what we shared.
Sure. So in material terms, during COVID, we had situations here where we were spending a lot of money helping stand up an industry base to produce, again, both surgical masks and respirators. And we had one particular company who had a commercial contract with goods that were actually bonded for export, and I won't name the country, but from a country to Australia. But they then chose, because they felt it was in their national interest to prevent the export of that spun bond, it wasn't released from the warehouse for export. What would this agreement do to prevent that scenario happening again?
Senator Charlotte Blundell, I might attempt an answer to that very important question. There's nothing in the agreement that compels the members or the parties to source trade or locate investment in any one country, or to take or not take the action you just described. It is bound up in a shared value system around openness and transparency, a recognition that supply chains tend to be, if not global, regional, and that some of these vulnerabilities are resolved by de-risking those supply chains through cooperation. So it's another instrument for Australia to try to, in a collaborative way, ensure greater resilience. But it's not a silver bullet. It's not a guarantee that we could then deploy to prevent all kinds of actions of other countries. It's very much in the spirit of the values that Australia holds dear around trade and openness.
So the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, in its report into COVID's impact on foreign affairs, defence and trade, which I think came out in 2021, one of its recommendations was the government, having essentially done this kind of work to identify supply chain vulnerabilities, should enter into government-to-government agreements with trusted partners as a framework within which commercial entities could then contract for the goods they needed, but with that preemptive agreement of governments that we wouldn't see that kind of so-called national interest prohibition on the export that had been previously agreed. Are there, from your perspective, subsequent agreements intended, so once this work starts identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities, that we'll see that recommendation implemented, so there will be government-to-government frameworks established?
Yeah, Senator, the intent, but we're at the beginning, is that the Supply Chain Council and the parties having shared the vulnerabilities that the countries are willing to share with each other will work on cooperative action plans around risk mitigation. This is the intention that follows. But the detail of that is not yet clear. One of the issues that was emerging while the agreement was being negotiated was a disruption to the availability of a chemical that the trucking industry needs. And this had gone into short supply and created risks, and again was one of those things that reminded people about the risks of market concentration. And so with industry discussion, with international cooperation, particularly I think, and Donna, please correct me, between Indonesia and Japan and Korea and Australia, there was a capacity to source sort of alternative supply, which then prevented any kind of crisis in Japan, Korea and Australia at that time, and highlighted, I think, the importance of having the dialogue, the systematic approach, the early simulation and the communication pathways available for us to be able to really quickly and systematically respond to those kinds of challenges that are, we expect to see repeated over and over again into the future.
Sure. So, second last question, Chair. Ms. Blundell, as somebody who's clearly a leader of this supply chain resilience work, have you read the Joint Standing Committee Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade report into the lessons of COVID?
Yes, I have, Senator.
Okay, great to hear. Process question then. If other nations have managed to actually indicate their internal processes are completed and they were able to sign up by February, what's been the delay from Australia's perspective that this committee is only seeing this now?
I don't believe we think that we're delayed. I think that some countries simply have shorter processes between signing and ratifying, Senator.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Mr. Pike?
No questions from me, Chair. Thank you very much.
Just finish with one, because I think in the list of critical goods that was given earlier, there were some, fuel additives, and we've heard about the AdBlue situation. I mean, liquid fuels is the good that I think goes right to the very top of any list in terms of Australia's resilience. And I assume that perhaps it wasn't listed because there's already an international agreement that governs the supply of liquid fuel through the International Energy Agency. I guess my kind of question is that's a very, very essential good, hence, and we've experienced shocks and supply chain problems in the past, hence the IEA stockholding obligations and all of the rest of it. From Australia's point of view, you know, we are unfortunately a member of that agreement that doesn't have a great record. We've been a long way short of our stockholder obligation for a period of time, and both this government and the former government have sort of attended to that problem, the sort of liquid fuel security issue. I'm just interested, and you might want to take this on notice, where that work is up to. I mean, I know at one point there was a sort of an expectation. We were buying fuel tickets was one thing, and we were starting to do some other things around fuel storage capacity improvements and some industry storage obligations. But there was, I believe, a commitment that we had made to the IEA to bring ourselves back into full 90-day compliance by 2026, which is getting pretty close now. And unless something has dramatically improved, I would suspect that we're probably not going to be in full compliance in 2026. So I wouldn't mind if you take on notice just where those efforts are up to. But what you perhaps could answer just now to finish off is whether or not the way that agreement has worked, or in some cases not worked perfectly, whether that's a sort of a reference point for what is being sought through this new set of supply chain arrangements. Chris, would you mind responding to that question?
Sure. So, look, I think, Chair, this topic did actually come up during the negotiations around the crisis response mechanism. I think there was a sort of general agreement from the parties that the IEA mechanisms were the appropriate forum for dealing with those issues. So it's not really envisioned that this would be covering a fuel shortage, for example, the crisis response mechanism. There is already in place a very advanced mechanism through the IEA. So it's not something we would be really seeking to cover through this agreement.
Okay, thank you for that and for all of your time and evidence here today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of that evidence and have the opportunity to request changes to any transcription errors. Please provide responses to any questions taken on notice. So I would like just something back on the separate progress that is being made in relation to our IEA obligations. I know that's ongoing work, but it's something that this committee has an interest in. I mean, in the last parliament, we entered into some of those international agreements, particularly on the fuel ticket side of the equation. So I think it's worth us hearing back something about where that is all up to. And could you provide that to us by the close of business on the 22nd of July, so in a week's time. But having said that, again, thank you all for coming in and giving us the benefit of your expertise and experience in these matters, and thanks to the Secretariat, as always, for making it all work in this distributed technological format that we use. And having said that, I now declare this meeting closed.